My neighbor called me petty after she used my electricity for 5 months straight. Not borrowed it. Not accidentally plugged something in once and forgot about it. 5 months. Every night. And the crazy part is, she acted like I was the unreasonable one when I finally told her to stop. My name is Travis Mercer. I'm 44 years old, and I own a diesel equipment repair shop on 8 acres outside Red Mesa, Arizona. It's the kind of place where people still wave when they pass each other on the road, where everyone knows which pickup belongs to which family, and where a broken tractor during harvest season is considered a genuine emergency. I've lived there for almost 15 years, long enough to know that most neighbor disputes don't start with screaming. They start with assumptions. The property next to mine had been empty for years before she arrived. One dusty Tuesday morning, 3 moving trucks rolled in behind a shiny black Range Rover, and by sunset, half the county already knew somebody from California had bought the place. Her name was Vanessa Hart, 40 years old, ran some kind of online lifestyle coaching business, worked from home, posted inspirational quotes for a living. At least that's what my buddy Rick claimed after finding her social media page. The house she built looked completely out of place. My side of the property was practical. Metal shop building, equipment yard, storage containers, pickup trucks, oil stains. Her side looked like a luxury resort brochure. White stucco walls, massive windows, perfect landscaping, outdoor fire pit. And in the garage sat a brand new electric SUV that probably cost more than my first house. At first, we got along fine. She brought over homemade muffins during her first week. I helped her locate the shutoff valve when a landscaper accidentally broke an irrigation line. Normal neighbor stuff. Nothing special. Nothing dramatic. Looking back, that's probably why I ignored the warning signs. The first weird thing happened in early April. I was locking up the shop around 9 at night when I noticed something bright against the dirt. An orange extension cord. Not a little household cord either. This thing looked like it belonged on a construction site. It ran from an exterior outlet on the side of my shop fence, crossed 20 feet of open ground, and disappeared under her garage door. I remember standing there staring at it for a second because my brain genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. I walked over, picked it up. The cord felt warm, very warm. I unplugged it and just stood there holding the end in my hand while looking toward her house. The garage lights were on. A faint blue glow reflected off the ceiling. Her vehicle had been charging, using my electricity. I figured maybe there was some explanation. Maybe a contractor plugged it in. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe it was temporary. So I left a note. Simple. Professional. Please do not use the outlet located on my property. If there is an issue with your electrical service, feel free to come talk to me. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning the cord was plugged back in, and sitting on my workbench was a laminated card. I still remember exactly what it said. It's just power, Travis. Let's not make this a thing. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Somebody had walked onto my property, plugged into my electrical system, ignored my note, then somehow convinced themselves I was the one creating a problem. That evening, I finally checked my utility bills. March was up nearly $200. April wasn't much better. I pulled records from the previous year, then the year before that. The numbers didn't lie. Something had changed, and suddenly that orange cord looked a whole lot more expensive. The following afternoon, I caught Vanessa outside near her driveway. She was watering plants while talking through wireless earbuds. When she saw me walking over, she smiled. The same smile she'd used when she brought those muffins. "Hey, neighbor." I nodded toward the cord. "You're pulling power from my shop." She glanced at it and shrugged. "Oh, that." Just 2 words. "Oh, that." Like we were discussing a garden hose. My contractor said the outlet was connected to the shared access easement. It isn't. Really. It comes off my panel. She crossed her arms. "Well, it's temporary." "How temporary?" "A few weeks. Maybe longer. The utility company is behind schedule." Then she said something that stayed with me for months afterward. "You've got plenty of capacity. It's not hurting anything." Maybe she thought she was being reasonable. Maybe she genuinely believed it. But standing there in the Arizona heat, listening to someone explain why my resources belong to them, I felt something shift. Because this wasn't about electricity anymore. It was about entitlement. And I had a feeling the orange cord was only the beginning. For the next couple of weeks, I kept telling myself not to overreact. That sounds ridiculous now, But if you've spent most of your life avoiding unnecessary conflict, you start looking for excuses on behalf of other people. Maybe she really didn't understand. Maybe the utility company had delayed her connection. Maybe this would sort itself out. But every night, I'd step outside after closing the shop and see that orange cord stretched across the dirt like it belonged there. Every night, her SUV would be charging. Every month, my bill climbed higher. Meanwhile, she acted like nothing was wrong. She'd wave from across the driveway, ask how business was going, talk about the weather, like we weren't living in completely different versions of reality. The final straw came one Friday afternoon. I was sitting in my office going through invoices when Rick stopped by. Rick owns a welding company down the road and has the personality of a man who considers diplomacy a medical condition. He grabbed a soda from my fridge and looked out the window. "You still letting California charge her spaceship off your building?" I sighed. "I'm working on it." "No, you're thinking about working on it. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting." I hated when he was right. That night, I dug out the original property records. The land had once been part of a large ranch before getting divided decades earlier. Most people never bother reading those documents. I did, and the deeper I looked, the stranger things became. The utility easement, the transformers servicing both homes, the original infrastructure agreements, everything traced back to one account, one owner, one responsibility, Mine. I read the paperwork 3 times. Then I drove into town Monday morning and met with the county records office. The clerk actually laughed when I explained the situation. Not because it was funny, because she'd apparently seen neighbor disputes like this before. An hour later, I walked out carrying copies of every document I needed. And that's when the entire situation changed. Because Vanessa wasn't simply using an outlet on my property. Her entire electrical connection relied on infrastructure legally attached to my parcel. The transformer, the distribution equipment, the maintenance obligations, all of it. Suddenly I understood why she'd been so casual. She didn't know. She assumed everything was shared, assumed someone else handled it, assumed the system would always be there. Most people never think about infrastructure. They flip a switch and lights come on. They plug something in and power appears. Magic, invisible magic. But I spent my entire life repairing machines. I know every system depends on somebody. Somebody builds it. Somebody maintains it. Somebody pays for it. And when people forget that, problems start. I didn't want a lawsuit. I didn't want a screaming match. I wanted leverage. The kind that makes people pay attention. 3 days later, I drove into Prescott and visited an electrical supply warehouse. The guy behind the counter was named Miguel. He'd helped me source parts for years. When he saw what I was buying, he raised an eyebrow. Building something interesting? Not building. I smiled. Managing. A current sensor. Industrial contactor. Load monitoring equipment. Completely legal. Completely safe. And, if installed correctly, incredibly annoying. Back at the shop, I spent an entire afternoon putting everything together. Nothing destructive. Nothing dangerous. The system would simply monitor electrical demand on the line feeding her property. If the load exceeded a preset limit, the circuit would briefly interrupt before resetting. 10 seconds off, then back on, again and again. Her household lights would barely notice. A high-powered vehicle charger, however, that would be a different story. I finished just before sunset. Then I waited. At 9:14 p.m., I heard the familiar hum. The charger had started. A few moments later, click, silence. 10 seconds passed. Click, power returned. Then the charger restarted. A minute later, click, silence again. I leaned back in my office chair and stared out the window toward her garage. 5 months. 5 straight months. For the first time since this started, I felt like the situation was finally moving. The next morning, nothing happened. No texts, no phone calls, no confrontation. Day 2 was considerably more entertaining. I happened to be servicing a skid steer when her garage door opened. Then closed. Then opened again. Then closed. 3 times in less than 10 minutes. I pretended not to notice. A few minutes later, she emerged holding her phone. She unplugged the charger. Plug it back in. Waited. The charging light appeared. Then vanished. Again and again. The expression on her face gradually shifted from confusion to irritation. By that evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Travis. Who's this? It's Vanessa. Her voice already sounded annoyed. I think there's something wrong with the power. Really, my charger keeps disconnecting. I looked out the window toward the dark desert. Everything looks normal over here. Pause. A long pause. Well, it never happened before. That's interesting. Another pause. Then she hung up. The following afternoon, she marched across the gravel driveway with the determination of somebody arriving to deliver bad news. No smile. No friendly greeting. No neighborly conversation. She walked straight into my shop and stopped 10 feet from my workbench. Are you doing something to the power? I slowly set down the wrench in my hand. Am I managing electrical load on infrastructure I maintain? Her eyes narrowed. You're playing games. No. Then explain why my charger suddenly doesn't work. Couldn't tell you. That's nonsense. I shrugged. She took another step closer. I have clients. Meetings. My vehicle needs to charge. And I've got bills. You're retaliating. No. I looked directly at her. I'm establishing boundaries. For a second, neither of us spoke. The shop was quiet except for the ticking sound of a cooling engine nearby. Then she laughed. Not because she thought anything was funny. The kind of laugh people use when they think confidence alone can win an argument. This is unbelievable. No, I said. 5 months was unbelievable. That wiped the smile away. Completely. I walked into my office and returned carrying a manila envelope. I prepared it the night before. Every document organized. Every figure calculated. Every page labeled. I handed it to her. At first she flipped through casually. Then slower. Then very slowly. I watched the color drain from her face. Month by month utility increases. Estimated consumption. Infrastructure maintenance costs. Property records. Utility easement documentation. And finally, a proposed reimbursement demand, along with a formal cost-sharing agreement moving forward. She reached the last page and stared at it, then looked up at me. You cannot be serious. Oh, I'm serious. The desert wind rattled the shop door behind us. For the first time since this whole mess began, Vanessa looked uncertain. Not angry, not superior. Uncertain, because she was finally seeing the system she'd been standing on top of the entire time. And she was beginning to realize exactly who had been holding it together. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Vanessa stood there holding the envelope while the late afternoon sun spilled through the open bay door behind her. Dust drifted through the light. Somewhere across the yard, an air compressor kicked on and then shut off again. You want me to pay all of this? She finally asked. I nodded. I want you to pay for what you used. Her eyes moved back to the paperwork. And this agreement? That's for the future. She stared at me like she was trying to decide whether I was bluffing. Then came the response I had expected from the beginning. I'm getting an attorney. I shrugged. You should. That answer caught her off guard. Most people expect resistance when they threaten legal action. Instead, I pointed toward the documents. Bring those records. Bring the utility statements. Bring the easement paperwork. Let them read everything. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue. Then she stopped, because there wasn't much left to argue about. Facts have a way of ending conversations. She left without another word. That night, the charger continued its little dance. On, off, on, off. I slept better than I had in months. 3 days later, a certified envelope showed up. I remember standing in my shop with grease on my hands when the mail carrier handed it over. I opened it expecting a lawyer's letter. Instead, I found a cashier's check. Every dollar of the additional electrical cost. Every maintenance charge. Everything. The total was actually slightly higher than what I'd requested. Tucked behind the check was the agreement. Signed. Initialed. Notarized. I just stood there staring at it. Not because I felt victorious. Honestly, what I felt was relief. The fight was over. Nobody had to sue anybody. Nobody had to call the sheriff. Nobody had to turn a neighbor dispute into a courtroom drama. For the next several months, things became surprisingly peaceful. The orange cord disappeared. The electrical system operated normally. And for the first time since she'd moved in, Vanessa started communicating before making decisions. A contractor installing new equipment? I'd get a text. Adding a battery backup system? She'd ask questions first. Most of our conversations were short, professional, respectful, exactly the way they should have been from the beginning. Then something happened that I never saw coming. About 6 months later, a convoy of trucks rolled onto her property. Solar installers. Panel after panel started appearing on her roof. By the end of the week, the place looked like a small power station. Shiny black panels covered nearly every section that faced the sun. Battery systems were installed in her garage. New inverters. New equipment. The whole setup probably cost more than some houses. I watched from my shop and figured that was her way of making sure she never had to depend on anybody again. Honestly, I respected it. A little expensive maybe, but I respected it. After everything that happened, independence probably felt pretty good. A week after the installation finished, I was closing up for the evening when I heard footsteps outside. I looked up and saw Vanessa standing near the entrance. She was holding a six-pack of local craft beer. For a second, I honestly thought she had the wrong building. "You busy?" she asked. "Usually." She laughed softly. Then she stepped inside. The shop looked different through her eyes. I could tell. The old welding table. The worn concrete floor. The photographs hanging on the wall. The picture of my father above the workbench. She noticed that one immediately. "Your dad." I nodded. "He started all this." She studied the photo for a moment, then set the beer on a nearby toolbox. "I owe you an apology." Those weren't words I expected to hear. Not from her. Not after everything. I crossed my arms and waited. She took a breath. "I made assumptions." I smiled slightly. "Yeah, you did." Another small laugh escaped her. The uncomfortable kind. "The truth is, where I used to live, people didn't really think about infrastructure. Everything was managed by somebody else. If there was a problem, you called a number. Out here," I said, "you were the number." That actually made her laugh. A real laugh this time. Then she looked around the shop again. "I thought you were being petty." I know. I didn't understand what was actually involved. For a second, neither of us spoke. The evening light was fading outside. The desert was turning gold. Then orange. Then something close to purple. Funny thing is, that's the moment I stopped being angry. Not because she paid. Not because I won. Because I realized we'd both been carrying around stories about each other. In her version, I was some stubborn mechanic protecting territory for no reason. In my version, she was an entitled outsider who thought money solved everything. Neither version was completely true. People are usually more complicated than the stories we invent about them. Over the following year, we settled into something that looked a lot like mutual respect. Not friendship exactly, but respect. If a storm knocked something out, she'd ask for help. If she had contractors coming in, she'd communicate. If I needed access near the shared easement, she'd cooperate. The tension disappeared. Life moved on. And every once in a while, usually at barbecues or community events, somebody still brings up the story. The famous orange extension cord. The Tesla charger. The load controller. The check. Everybody has an opinion. Some people think I should have disconnected everything immediately. Others think I should have ignored the whole thing and kept the peace. A few think I went too far. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. What I know is this. The dispute was never really about electricity. It was about boundaries. It was about responsibility. It was about what happens when someone mistakes access for ownership. Because whether we're talking about power lines, water systems, businesses, friendships, or communities, somebody is always carrying the responsibility behind the scenes. And eventually that responsibility deserves respect. A few months ago, I came home after sunset and noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time. Silence. No extension cord. No charging lights. No arguments. Just the soft glow of solar panels reflecting moonlight across the desert. I stood there for a minute looking across the property line. Then I smiled and went inside. Because sometimes the best ending isn't beating somebody. It's teaching them where the line was all along. Now here's what I'd love to know from you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shut the power off immediately? Would you have taken her to court? Or would you have handled it exactly the way I did? And on the other side of that question, if you were Vanessa, would you have paid the moment you saw the bill? Or would you have fought back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read far more of them than people think, and I'm genuinely curious where you land on the line between being petty and standing your ground. Because sometimes those two things look almost identical until you're the one paying the bill.